The night air over the Ardennes carried a crisp metallic taste, frost and fuel and fear, when the prisoner finally talked. He had been smug the day we pulled him from the shattered hedgerow, a Luftwaffe lieutenant with a nose once elegant and now bent sideways, still bleeding through the bandage. "Fliegende Milchflaschen," he had laughed, showing pink teeth through split lips. "Flying milk bottles." The nickname rippled down the line of guards like a dirty joke. Yet hours later, under the lamp's steady hum and the tick of a captured Junghans on the table, his voice thinned to a rasp. "We were wrong," he said, eyes on the floorboards as though the truth might crawl out from between them. "You're overkill," the words snagged in his throat. "It is not excess. It is a law, a system." Outside, a cold front shifted. Far off, thunder rolled. Men who had flown against the thunderbolt swore it could summon that sound on a clear day. We laughed too once. Not at the men, never at the men, but at the airplane's absurdity. 7 tons, with the stance of a bulldog and the grace of a steel mill. Its fuselage looked like someone had sawed off a piece of the Statue of Liberty and taught it to fly. Yet inside that armored barrel was a physics problem the war did not see coming. A turbo-supercharged heart that did not gasp for breath above 30,000 feet, 8 half-inch Brownings that turned seconds into verdicts, and a fuel appetite large enough to haul it across the North Sea and back with fury to spare. It arrived in Europe in the spring of 1943, with the social confidence of an anvil dropped in a salon. German aces smirked. American rookies missed their turns and bled airspeed. On certain April mornings, the sky looked like a chalkboard where instructors scrawled mistakes with contrails. By then, the Luftwaffe believed it understood the American problem. We built big, then bigger, then somehow bigger than that, as though size itself were a doctrine. The Tiger II tank, lean with menace, sat like a proof that German engineering could calculate circles around a Detroit assembly line. In the first scraps over the Reich, the P-47 seemed to confirm old prejudices. It took a while to climb. It drank octane like a barn fire. It did not dart. It committed. When a Messerschmitt Bf 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 cut a clean arc in the blue and the Thunderbolt heaved itself into a turn, the mathematics of moment of inertia produced a cruel joke. By the time our pilot had wrapped the weight around, the opportunity was 2 counties away. It changed for a simple reason that sounds sentimental until you count. The airplane did not have to turn to win. It had to fall, fast. "Boom and zoom" was the phrase the veterans wrote on blackboards for the new kids. "Climb high," where the German DB605s and BMW 801s thinned out in the cold. Watch the fight like a hawk watches a field. Then drop with the planet tugging at you, trading potential for kinetic, 1,000 feet per beat, the air beginning to scream along the ribs. Line the deflection thick and press 8 triggers. The first time a young pilot felt the ship truly dive, he learned a new language written in vibration. Before that doctrine hardened, there were months of embarrassment. Training films spoke in a clean grammar that reality did not respect. Fresh-faced lieutenants drifted wide through turns, over-controlled on final, or bolted early from escorts to chase a glint that turned into nothing against the sun. Debrief notes clustered around the same phrases: late break, overshot, got slow, tunnel vision. Mechanics watched from the hard stand with folded arms as if they were refereeing an argument between gravity and pride. The Thunderbolt did not forgive stupidity, but it tolerated human limits. and in that tolerance was the seed of a method. You could make a mistake and still have a second try. You could catch a burst and still bring metal home. Men who survived errors lived long enough to stop making the same ones. That is a hidden engine in any war, survival compounds experience. The airplane's bulk paid an interest rate in lives that smaller, prettier machines could not match. Robert Johnson learned the rate in June 1943 when a German ace pinned him in the sky and wrote a death sentence across his cockpit. Bullets chewed the canopy, stitched metal, breathed fire through the floor. At the end, he counted more than 200 holes and kept the counting short because numbers were starting to blur. Yet the ship stayed together, a factory's oath made aluminum. Back on the ground, men circled it like a monument with an inscription not yet carved. Johnson's survival moved like folklore across squadrons, an unkillable rumor that happens to be true. Pilots began to trust the armor that wrapped their legs and bellies, and the engine huge enough to drag them out of reversals that would have corkscrewed other fighters into the wheat. Trust turns to doctrine faster than most historians like to admit. The Thunderbolt's gunnery, 3,400 rounds split across 8 Brownings, rewrote the timing of a pass. If a Spitfire made you be elegant, and a 109 made you be precise, the P-47 made you be decisive. Close, fire, leave. The airplane did not slash with a rapier. It took the sky's ribcage in both hands and squeezed. Combat reports began to stack on mess tables with the smell of coffee and cordite. Short bursts, sometimes 2 seconds, and enemy laminate peeled away in silver strips. Walls of lead. Pilots used that phrase even though it was copper-jacketed steel and chemistry does not care for poetry. Met the Luftwaffe in the merge. The gear change came in 1944 with a propeller that looked at first like a cosmetic fix. Paddle blade, they called it, broad enough that the ground crew joked about frying steaks on it if the war ever paused for supper. It was not cosmetic. The new blades grabbed the air like a man grabs a rung when he decides to live. All at once the heavy fighter leapt in climb and lunged in acceleration. Germans who had memorized the Thunderbolt's earlier timing found themselves missing counts. It is a special panic to be confident in the calculations that keep you alive and to feel the math betray you in mid-air. A whisper moved among pilots who had watched the P-47's silhouette get larger in a window where it should have stayed small. Something has changed. Somewhere in upstate New York or a plant in Evansville, a change order had become a new battlefield. The truth underneath each tactical note was not mechanical. It was industrial. When the Luftwaffe tried to reassign its aces as a scarce resource, America assigned factories as an inexhaustible one. You could not out-brilliant a river of parts. There is a moment in every war when the ledger gains a conscience and starts to argue with strategy. Trains become arteries. Ball bearings become vitamins. Flight hours become a sacrament you can afford to lavish on the young. In a world of rationed genius, America traded in abundance. Schweinfurt and Regensburg put that abundance on a grim stage. The mission plans read like a dare, the flak maps like a confession. Thunderbolts bent to their role, escort to the border of range, slash at interceptors, then turn home while fortresses drew chalk lines across Germany alone. There were days when the weight of the bombers' losses pressed so hard on the fighter groups that laughter sounded like trespass. Yet in the ledger, each pass the P-47 bought with speed and altitude was a minute subtracted from the enemy's options. Our pilots learned to read the enemy's climb profiles the way farmers read the weather. The lag at 25,000, the cough at 30, the honest panic when the fight refused to slide down the altitude scale. And then, as tanks and drop tanks and longer legs arrived like new verbs in a shared language, the geometry widened. The escort line stretched deeper. The rendezvous with returning bombers no longer felt like a coin toss. A heavy fighter built for high war found itself imagining a new career. That career began at treetop height. Someone discovered the ship would carry anything you could bolt to it and still behave. The pilots grinned like men discovering a hidden gear in a familiar truck. Rockets grew from the wings like second thoughts, then first thoughts, then doctrine. The Brownings had always been legislators of air. Now they wrote law on the ground. Rail yards learned to fear the monotone moan of a dive. Columns learned to fear the punctuation of rockets. 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 68,000 trucks, numbers that read like errors until you walk the tracks and count spare parts in fields. German soldiers called it Jabo fever, because the body sometimes needs a medical term for what the mind cannot tolerate. Fever implies delirium, but nothing hallucinated about a thunderbolt's shadow crossing a hedgerow at 400 knots. If you were caught in the open, you learned how long a second can be when each one is an argument with metal. To the POWs who began arriving in quantity, overkill went from a clever sneer to a private superstition. Overkill meant you would be found again tomorrow, even if you hid well today. Overkill meant a downed rail could be relayed by morning. Yes, but it would be lifted again by noon. Overkill meant the airplane you thought you understood last spring was a new animal by autumn, because a lettered crate had crossed an ocean and been unboxed by a man with grease to his elbows at 3 a.m. Some of the prisoners spoke of Gallen's phrase, "We made a terrible mistake," with the wrung-out respect men reserve for a sentence that sets a broken bone. He had not praised us. He had conceded a misreading of the age. Germany had wagered on precision and ran out of time. America had wagered on schedule and made time. The Thunderbolt was the schedule given wings and teeth. Then jets arrived, and for a bright, unpleasant minute, it seemed the future would erase the present. Me-262s cut through the air like a new idea, with no punctuation. The first time a Thunderbolt pilot saw one close, he felt the sick knowledge that no amount of courage adjusts a red line. But doctrine has a way of turning miracles into maintenance problems. Jets needed long concrete, fuel pure enough to spoil, space enough to warm turbines while counters clicked off seconds like a funeral bell. "Don't chase," flight leaders said. "Erase. Erase runways, fuel bowsers, taxiways, hangars, power lines. Erase bridges feeding the bases and the trains that fed the bridges." The P-47 erased nouns, and the miracle discovered it needed adjectives to survive. Soon the miracle flew from grass, at dusk, in a hurry, with fuel that left the turbines coughing, and miracles are fragile when handled rough. The heavy fighter did not outsprint the future. It shortened the future's day. In Normandy, the doctrine spilled into hedgerows like water finds a ditch. A panzer that had once looked like destiny began to resemble a job. Rockets made a new punctuation. The Brownings wrote the rest. Farmers learned a new weather sign, the way birds go silent a breath before the scream of a dive. Pilots developed an odd intimacy with the roofs of freight cars, the pitch of their tar paper, the way steam looked when a locomotive bled. After the strike, a pilot might find his hands trembling around a thermos cup he did not remember filling. Tremor is what happens when a man spends adrenaline like cash for too long. The airplane did not tremble. It asked for more gas and more belts. Ground crews learned to reload while a prop still ticked heat, to swap out a battered panel in the time it took a man to tell a joke cleanly. In that choreography lay a nation's temperament, impatient, practical, allergic to mystique. By winter, the Luftwaffe was a rumor at noon and a threat only in certain corners at dawn. The rumor still killed. Aces did not vanish in smoke. They went to ground, then to staff, then to cemeteries that do not brag. But the average German pilot met an average American machine and found the averages unfair. 15,683 thunderbolts. Count the weight of that number. Count the wooden crates. Count the forgotten men on night shifts who came home with hearing like a broken radio. The sky is not democratic by nature, but it responds to mass. A doctrine based on husbanding a few fine blades had met a doctrine based on dulling many and replacing them overnight. The wonder is not that the outcome favored arithmetic. The wonder is that anyone once believed it wouldn't. When peace came in its awkward boots, prisoners stood on rail platforms and squinted at civilian metals that gleamed where war metals had burned. The lieutenant with the ruined nose got his nose fixed, we heard, and opened a small shop that sold practical things. He talked too much for a while, as men do when memory still believes it can tidy up the past if it says enough nouns in a row. And then he learned to be quiet, as men do when the past does not end. Somewhere in America, a museum guide explains the big fighter with the round fuselage to fourth graders who taste Pez and not cordite. She says it was overbuilt, and they ask what that means. She tells them it means a machine can carry more than it needs, and one of them, there is always one, asks why that matters. She points at a map of Europe and draws her finger across a year and a half, and the room understands. Years later, that lieutenant visited an air show. Not ours. We learned of it from a friend of a friend, and he stood under the broad wings of a restored Thunderbolt, with a face like a man listening to a radio tuned just off the station. The pilot's demonstration was not war. The dive was shallow, the guns silent, the engine civilized. But the shape was the shape, and the sound rolled across the crowd with that same hint of weather. Someone near him made a joke about milk bottles, and he smiled, then shook his head, and answered with a quietness that did not ask for sympathy. It was not a joke, he said. It was a factory with teeth. The man who had been young and wrong walked into the shade and put a hand on aluminum that had been polished by soft cloth and soft time. What you touch when you touch a Thunderbolt is not simply airplane. It is the notion that a country can decide to be larger than the day before. The story does not end. It tapers. Machines go to museums or to barns, and the men who flew them go to photographs. But the logic remains. In any century, eyes will narrow at the sight of something that looks too heavy to soar, and someone will mutter about fat margins, redundancy, waste. The mutter always sounds clever in the draft. Then the sky opens again, and the cleverness becomes a cough. The assembly line hums, the parts pile high, the schedule insists, and the thing that looked like overkill puts its shoulder for the task, while lean brilliance looks for a ladder. In those minutes when history judges tactics, it often renders a verdict in the grammar of logistics. So we keep a certain respect when thunder rumbles on a clear day. We recall a big-bellied fighter with a fistful of machine guns and a heart that loved the thin air. We remember the POW who arrived with a joke and left with a vocabulary. We remember Johnson counting holes until counting lost its purpose. And we remember young pilots who learned that courage is easier to find in a cockpit built by strangers who cared enough to be excessive. We remember factories that worked late and rails that learned humility. We remember that overkill is not what happens to the enemy. It is what your own worst luck cannot quite overcome. And in the end, we remember that when the wind runs across a broad wing, it makes a sound that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with will. Now, if you want to count the lesson the way an engineer counts stress, lay out the inputs. Start with octane and air. The turbo supercharger is a bargain you strike with altitude. You promise heat and fuel. It promises density. Bolt armor to the promise, so a man's femur can lean against it and not break when the canopy blooms with sparks. Overspec the gear, so a hard landing is a lecture and not a funeral. Give the pilot guns he can feel in his teeth, so that the pass is something his whole body measures. Then give him training hours that pile up like wood under a winter porch. Make the first mistake survivable, and he will stop repeating it. Make the second rare. Arrange the logistics so a request becomes a crate, becomes a fix, becomes a sortie tomorrow at Zorro 700, with a fresh prop that eats air like hunger. You cannot reduce that to romance, but you can set it to music, the rhythm section being shift whistles and freight cars, the melody being an engine cruising at manifold pressure that sounds like assurance. If you insist on counters, the ledger obliges 3,652 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, but that only sketches the edge of the picture. The middle is freight made still, roads made quiet, bridges turned to lessons. The rest is pilots coming home with sweat freezing at their collars and the odd, insane grin that means they stood their ground at 20,000 feet and did not blink. The rest is ground crews who could change a cylinder with their eyes half closed and then argue amiably about baseball they hadn't listened to in 2 summers. The rest is POWs, learning the grammar of abundance and running out of jokes. The rest is a certain poverty of imagination corrected at scale. When you say overkill, you confess not that the other man has too much, but that you had counted on him having less. That is not a tactic. That is a hope. Hope is not a plan. The last time I saw the lieutenant, he had grown comfortable in silence, a neatness that did not quite fit his hands, as if he was still tempted to clench them around a control column. He had the dignity of contrition and the small, decent vanity of someone who knows he had once been good at a hard thing. He asked me if the Thunderbolt was difficult to love when you first met it, and I told him the truth. It is easier to love what does not require you to pretend. The airplane was honest about its weight. It did not hide its appetite. It did not hide its labor. It only asked to be flown in the grammar it supplied. Start high, stay fast, hit hard, leave clean, come back. He nodded, as if the verb order matched a truth he had learned too late. We parted on a platform where civilian trains chuffed with a sound that was only smoke and not warning. He lifted a hand the way a man salutes when no flag is present. I lifted mine because the day had asked for a simple human ceremony and finally deserved one. If you stand under a museum thunderbolt now, the aluminum smells like dust and polish. Children press fingers to rivet lines. Docents explain how a wing is not a wing, but a decision extended into air. Across the room, a chart lists production totals, and a map shows arrows swarming overseas. A parent crouches to translate boring numbers into a bedtime story, and maybe the story ends with a gentle sentence about hard work and fairness and the world getting better. But if the parent wants to be exact, perhaps the last sentence is stranger and truer. Sometimes the world is saved by too much of a good thing, arranged in time. Sometimes the right answer is not a clever idea, but a warehouse. Sometimes mercy is a margin. The thunderbolt was a margin with a throttle. It stood there, round and loud, and dared mockery to wait a year and see. Mockery waited. It learned. It stopped. That is the long arc from laughter to respect, from flying milk bottle to the noise that empties roads. It runs through weather at 30,000 feet and hedgerows at 30 feet, through machine shops with windows that rattled at midnight, through hands stained with oils that do not wash out quick. It passes by names we remember, Johnson, Gayland, and thousands we don't, men who loaded belts until their fingers went numb, and pilots who worried their oxygen masks like rosaries. It ends, if you can say ends, at a runway where a big fighter taxis in, and the prop ticks slower, then stops, and a pilot sits with the canopy open to the smell of cut grass and hot metal, and feels, for a hard, clear minute, that he is a small part of a nation that learned the difference between excess and enough. He climbs down. He touches the cowling the way you might touch a friend's shoulder. He looks up. The sky is empty, and for once, that is the victory. So the next time thunder rolls on a clear day, you could be forgiven for glancing up. You might remember a broad wing and a rule written into air. Climb high, dive hard, fire once, and let the factories do the rest. You might remember that the men who scoffed learned to whisper, and the men who were mocked learned to smile without malice. You might remember the smell of cordite, even if you have never smelled it, and the strange, reassuring weight of a machine built with room to spare. And if someone beside you says overkill with a smirk that thinks it's wisdom, you could answer gently. Sometimes overkill is just another word for not losing. In the months when the doctrine was still a rumor and not yet a reflex, we built habits the way a mason builds a wall. Horizontal rows, steady hands, no shortcuts that would shame the corner. New pilots learned pre-flight by feel, palms memorizing the temperature of metal at dawn, fingertips teaching themselves what a loose fastener feels like without looking. In classrooms that smelled faintly of chalk and cold coffee, instructors sketched elliptical turn radii that meant little until a man saw what a wide turn could cost him when a Focke-Wulf pounced inside the circle. We dissected gun camera film like surgeons in an amphitheater, pausing frames where tracers walked up to the cockpit of an enemy who had believed he was safe, rewinding again and again until the room could recite the geometry of the kill shot as if it were catechism. The older hands spoke gently to the young about fear, and not out of compassion alone. Fear was part of the equipment list. It sat on the checklist between mixture and magnetos. You did not discard it. You strapped it in, tightened it down, and used it to keep your eyes honest. Stateside, a different rhythm worked its own miracle. In Evansville, Long Island, Farmingdale, and plants with names that have not survived the century, women and men learned a conversation with rivets that produced an aircraft every few hours when the line sang. Wide windows trembled with the indecorous bass of engines being tested at all hours. The lunch pails were plain, and the jokes were better when a crate was on schedule. Foremen who in peacetime would have scolded for scrap learned to praise for speed and forgive for ingenuity, because speed and ingenuity were the point. Rail spurs sagged with the mass of parts. Inspection stamps became talismans. You do not have to love machines to work this way. You only have to believe that the machine, properly made, will be good to someone you will never meet. That belief was the grease in the gears of production, and it ran from the mill to the flight line with fewer leaks than anyone expected. The men who ferried brand-new Thunderbolts west to east across America collected a map of coffee counters in their heads. They would sit at a Formica bar under a sign that said, "Pie," watching locals pretend not to stare at the monster outside, and they would answer the same questions with the same idiomatic pride. How fast? Fast enough. How far? Far enough. Is it safe? Safer than the boys without one. Then they would sign receipts, swap jokes about the weight of a full ammo load, and step back into the cockpit where the leather smelled of oil and new promises. Somewhere over corn, they would push the throttle forward just a breath past polite, and feel the ship answer like a big animal that trusts its rider. Somewhere over pine, they would check fuel the way a man checks his wallet near the end of a month. By the time the aircraft reached a ship, and then reached England, and then reached a field where the mud had memorized 1,000 boots, it had been held by more hands than any romance could count. And all those hands had done one thing right after another. We speak often about single missions because narratives crave the convergent line of a day's events, but the truth that defeated the Luftwaffe was mostly serial and mostly boring. Trains, trucks, tankers, depots, marshalling yards, bridges, culverts, the nouns that feed an army. A P-47 does not care for poetry when the target list is written in cubic yards. The pilots did what the list asked and learned to take the small satisfactions of visible change. A plume of steam that speaks of a ruptured boiler, a streak of flame across tar and gravel that tells you a tanker will be late to the front, a smashed switch stand that will cost a day to replace even if every man on the rail crew is a genius. At debrief, a young man might speak of a locomotive like a thing he hated, but the older ones didn't. They understood hate is a poor carpenter. They spoke instead of work and results, of lanes opened for our side and closed for the other, of miles that now took longer to travel, and therefore held fewer deaths for men they had never met in infantry divisions spread thin across a continent. When Big Week came and our bombers flew day after consecutive day into skies that had been promised to swallow them, the Thunderbolt's personality matured. It stopped being a novelty that critics called clumsy and became an institution that other men trusted. There is a gravity in trust that shifts the behavior of the whole formation. Escorts began to anticipate rather than react, leaning into intercept vectors like chess players who carry 3 variations ahead and a reservoir of patience behind. The best pilots learned to be quiet on the radio and loud with the guns, and the rookies learned that the best speech you can make in combat is a short burst that makes someone else's sentence impossible to finish. When a staffel appeared, it meant not only planes, but a system. The system did not argue, it performed. A chunk of anger and a chunk of aluminum were each present in the recipe. But the secret was schedule, redundancy, predictable excellence. The Germans had built a machine to produce aces. We had built a machine to produce average men who could not be defeated by shortage. There were mistakes, and some were worse than mistakes because they were patterns. A few pilots took the Thunderbolt's forgiveness as license and dove too long into flak because invulnerability feels true, right up to the point it becomes a lie. Some learned the wrong lesson from Johnson's riddled survivorship and believed armor would lift them out of any arithmetic. Flak crews taught them about exponents. When a P-47 falls from low altitude, it falls like a sentence that does not want a period and takes one anyway. We buried men we loved and wrote letters that lied just enough. No doctrine uproots grief. But grief in a resilient system becomes resolve more often than it becomes despair. The next day, another pilot took a different angle on the same yard, and the boxcars burned, and the mission planner put a neat check beside a target that had been a rumor for a year. At 30,000 feet, the turbo supercharger's song was its own safety. It kept a pilot honest and a skeptic persuaded. You could feel how the air, rare and thin, stalled other machines and still fed yours. A man gets a certain moral authority when his airplane breathes better than the one trying to kill him. He can choose to fight or to deny battle, and in that choice is the difference between a war of showing off and a war of outcomes. From altitude, the world becomes a graph. From altitude, you truly see why the enemy cannot afford to loiter with you, why he must claw upward to close, and why his closing steals energy that you can spend on the exit. If the sky were a bank, the P-47 held the higher interest account. Down low, you spent like a sailor. Up high, you invested and watched compounding do its ugly, beautiful work. I remember a day over the rower when the plan looked like poetry and flew like math. We were to sweep ahead of a bombing group, then cross-cut their course perpendicular, then wheel into the teeth of an anticipated intercept. The Luftwaffe arrived. A clean, angry diagonal of 190s whose pilots had the alert poise of men who still believed in their luck. The merge lasted a half-second longer than usual because nobody flinched. Then the Thunderbolts did what the board at Group had taught us to do for 9 months. We fell. Not panicked, calculated. Each man picked a vector that spread the geometry. We painted the sky with lines of intent, and the Germans discovered that to follow us down was to trade their myth for our doctrine. A few did anyway because courage is its own gravity, and some paid, and some escaped a lesson you do not want to master twice. The bombers lived, which is a sentence that should always feel like a victory when the other choice is a funeral. On the ground, German civilians did the arithmetic faster than their generals. They began to place straw men beside bridges to draw fire, and for a day the trick worked on those who wanted to spare a structure by shooting at a puppet. Our pilots learned to look for the darker seam where wood would not lie quite right, and for the small human carelessness that even a careful laborer commits when the world is ending. Footprints where footprints should not be, a fresh bucket where the scene should be abandoned, the tidy coil of a hose where panic should have made a tangle. The thunderbolt is not an instrument for subtlety, but the man in it could be. The best of us learned to spend a rocket when a rocket was the right dollar, and to spend a burst when frugality would buy the same result. Ammunition is logistics translated into seconds. The better you budget seconds, the more of your friends see sundown. When Operation Market Garden climbed into the sky with its long, spear-headed hope, the P-47 flew cover and punishment both, finding in the Dutch light a clarity that makes every mistake look etched into glass. We saw columns that meant salvation for friends on a road, and columns that meant death for them if we hesitated. We hesitated as little as we could, and it was not enough. In the gap between what we could do and what men needed, a simple anger grew. Nothing operatic, just the craftsman's rage at being given a job too big for a single pair of hands. We did what we could, which is the most honest sentence anyone can write about that week. Later, in the winter, Ardennes, we flew when weather permitted, and when it did not, we paced tents like caged weather vanes and offered bad jokes to ward off the knowledge that men were dying behind the fog. When the ceiling finally lifted and the roads revealed themselves, the thunderbolt did what winter had denied it. It cleared lanes with ordnance and with noise, and a certain hope returned to voices on the ground net. On New Year's morning, when the enemy lit the sky with Operation Bodenplatte and tried to smash our fields with one hard fist, the thunderbolt met the gesture with the indifference of resilience. We lost planes, we lost men, we lost some innocence about how finished the Luftwaffe was. Then we counted, replaced, rearmed, and by the end of the week the fields looked busy again. That is how an industrial nation fights, not by denying the punch, but by absorbing it, reorganizing around the bruise, and arriving the next day with the same schedule and more energy than the other side can replenish. The thunderbolt, abused on the ground and dangerous in the air, did not romanticize any of this. It just kept flying, the way a good tool keeps working when the man wielding it has learned the right wrist and the right patience. Let us speak at last of the enemy without sneer. Many were brave. Many were skilled beyond most of us. They had been fed on a lean diet of scarcity and excellence, and they grew sharp. A sharp blade in a hungry hand can cut astonishingly. But if the blade is not replaced and the hand is not rested, the cuts get sloppy, and then they get slow, and then they stop. Our doctrine did not humiliate theirs. It exhausted it. German POWs who laughed at Overkill in 43 found themselves nodding in 45, as if consenting to a theorem they could not disprove. You rarely hear a good joke about abundance from a man who has outlived it. What you hear instead is a caution, and sometimes an admiration that refuses to call itself by its name. Some of them asked after the supercharger, as if it were a rumor about a film star. Some asked if our pilots had more hours than theirs, and when we said yes, they looked like men comparing birthdays with someone who had celebrated more often, as if the date itself were an achievement. Their engineers asked different questions, and we answered as much as the rules allowed, which was little. The rest they learned when the factories opened under supervision and the ledgers came out into the light. When the war ended and men tried to shrink back into themselves, the thunderbolt refused a little. It was too large for small memories. It sat in hangars and on grass like a retired prize fighter in a good suit, expecting to be noticed and getting its way. Some went to foreign air arms and flew on. Some went to scrap and made washing machines that hummed in peacetime kitchens, a dignified afterlife if you can tolerate the romance of it. Some went to museums where children press noses to plexiglass and ask if it really needed 8 guns. A patient voice says yes, because sometimes you don't need all 8 until the day you do, and on that day, there will not be time to wish for more. The parent who hears this nods, and then forgets, and then remembers at the oddest times, paying insurance, perhaps, or counting pills in a bottle, or planning a trip with a spare day added in case the roads do what roads do in the rain. The logic of overprovision is not a military secret. It is a human kindness writ large. If a man wants to understand why the thunderbolt turned smirks into silence, he can stand on any empty runway at dawn and listen. He will hear nothing, but he will feel the length. He will understand that length measured in seconds is a promise. This much time to accelerate, this much time to regret, this much time to try again. A nation built a runway across the Atlantic and called it production. The P-47 simply used it. We made mistakes, we paid, we learned, we iterated, we arrived over and over with more. That was the terror our enemies finally admitted, the terror of consistency. Not the lightning strike, but the weather report that is right every day for months. Not the single ace, but the 10th replacement who flies as if his hands were the first man's hands. Years later, when jets had become ordinary, and the sound of a turbine no longer meant miracle but commuter flight, a veteran pilot sat in a lawn chair at an air show and narrowed his eyes against sun. The Thunderbolt rose, leveled, dove, leveled, taxied home. He sipped a lemonade that elsewhere would have been a beer, and said to no one in particular that the airplane had always been honest. He meant more than he said. He meant that the machine did not pretend it would make a hero out of a fool. It would make a survivor out of a decent man on most days, and on some days it would fail, and the failure would be tragic but not treacherous. He meant that the airplane's silhouette kept its promises, and that is a rare courtesy in war. He meant that if you took the measure of it in 1943, and again in 1945, you would find it had grown not sleek, but inevitable. So let the last thought rest with a prisoner who once joked, and later did not. He was not a villain in his own story, just a man of his country and his craft who believed in the lightness of precision the way we believed in the gravity of abundance. He taught me something without meaning to. Mockery is a kind of hope. It says, "Surely nothing that ugly can be dangerous." But the world is not obligated to match our aesthetics. Sometimes protection wears a heavy coat. Sometimes justice is loud. Sometimes you need more than you think you will, and the wise course is to bring it and carry what you don't spend home for tomorrow. The Thunderbolt taught that to anyone who would listen, and to many who would not until it was too late. It taught it in the hammering language of 8 guns, and the obstinate grammar of a turbo that would not quit when the air thinned and the human will with it. It taught it until the laughter faded, and then it taught a quiet that felt like respect. In the soft hours before dawn, if you stand far from highways and closer to grass, you can hear weather before it arrives. Somewhere a long way off, a throat clears. The sky rearranges itself, and the day changes plans. That is what the Germans heard when they learned to listen for thunder on a clear day. It was not weather. It was policy with wings. It was factories speaking in chorus at altitude. It was the arithmetic of a nation that paid its bills ahead of time and brought change for the unlucky. It was a promise that mockery, however clever, would not carry the field. And if you close your eyes, you can hear it still, because certain sounds echo longer than their causes. The rest is memory and the long maintenance of peace, which is another kind of overkill that decent people should be grateful for even when they think they won't need it.